I have 2 months left of seminary. 2 months left of seminary of what was about 5 years, a 5-year-long journey. So about 5 years ago, if you guys remember, me and my wife, we packed up the station wagon with then 2 kids, sold most of our possessions, and made the 3-day journey down here to Dallas Theological Seminary. And we were very happy and very excited, and there's a certain naive optimism in the air. But unfortunately, that bubble was quickly popped when we kind of got into the Dallas area. And you come down off the highway, we came from Route 30, and you land in Fair Park. In Fair Park, the area leaves something to be desired. There's barbed wire on the bus steps, there's graffiti on all the buildings, and there's homeless people walking around, and it can be a little scary. And then we get to seminary, we arrive nice and early, and we find out that the movie company that we hired to take the rest of our stuff down to Texas wasn't going to show up for another 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, all these doubts start playing in my mind. What was if I can't find a job? What was if we can't find health insurance? What was if we don't like it here? What was if the community is not good in Swiss Tower? What if we can't find a church? What if my wife can't find work? We can't make enough money? What if there's failures? People get divorced in seminary. What if there's moral failures? And all these doubts and fears start playing in my head like a broken record. What do we do when doubts and fears settle in our hearts? I remember when these things started happening, I texted my mentor and I said, I don't feel ready for seminary. It's quite an undertaking. What do we do when we're afraid? What do we do when we have doubts and fears? Well, we need to understand one very important thing. If it's the Lord's plan, the Lord will make a path. If it's the Lord's plan, He will make the path. And most importantly, the Lord actually fights for us. The Lord fights for us. He is on our side. The Lord fights for us. One of the greatest relocation stories of the entire Bible is the story of the Exodus. And the Exodus reaches its climax on the banks of the Red Sea when Israel was caught with their doubts and fears, caught between a raging army and a scary sea. That's right, Josiah. That's right. Charging army and a raging sea. And we find out then that Israel had to learn that it's the Lord who fights for them. It's the Lord who fights for them. We're going to see 2 movements in this story. We're going to see that Israel should have saw that God is sovereign. Sovereign means that He's in control. And even though Israel didn't see that God is sovereign, Israel does see that God delivers them. Israel does see God's deliverance. So let's turn now to Exodus 14. Exodus 14. And we'll see that Israel should have seen that God is sovereign. Begin reading here. And then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp. And you shall encamp facing the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. And I, the Lord, will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh, and his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So first thing we realize right away, the Lord said to Moses, so God's speaking to Moses, and He says, tell the people of Israel. So God has this plan, and He's telling it to Moses, and He wants Moses to tell it to all the people. So God wants His plan known, and God is directing where Israel is going. He's literally showing them the path where to go. If you back up before Exodus 14, kind of our pericope starts in the end of chapter 13 when Israel left Egypt, and it says they left Egypt dressed ready for battle. So they're ready. And then it says that God moved them around the Philistines. So even though they were ready for battle, God was directing their path around Philistines, and He was directing them here to this very specific spot. And then He says something pretty remarkable. He says He will harden Pharaoh's heart. Only God can harden people's hearts. And God is displaying His sovereignty here. And look what happens in the next verses. Exactly what God says will happen does happen. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants were changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made his chariots ready, and he took his army with him, and he took 600 chariots, all the chariots of Egypt, the officers, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, the king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel. And the people of Israel were going out, and definitely the Egyptians pursued them. All of Pharaoh's horses, all of his chariots, all of his horsemen, and the army. And they overtook them at the encampment. So God decrees that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and Egypt will chase them. And that's exactly what happens.
They go in.
Now Egypt is chasing them. And the Lord is continuing to harden Pharaoh's heart. Now this phrase that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it sticks in our ears. Because some people think, well, this is not fair. What is God doing? What is God doing here? And it plays on our sense of right and wrong. All of us have that, don't we? We say, this is not fair. How is that not fair? If God was causing Egypt to pursue them, how is that fair? How is that right? How is that justice? And we need to understand one very important thing, and this is important for all the people in the room. Sometimes God does things that we can't fully understand, because we are his creators, and he is the creator. Sometimes his ways we just can't understand. And it's also important to note that God was not taking a good guy in Pharaoh and making him turn bad. When Pharaoh is introduced in the story, he's introduced as a bad guy. In chapter 5 and in chapter 3, when Moses is talking to Pharaoh, the first thing that Pharaoh says in the Exodus narrative says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" Pharaoh was not a good guy that went bad, a good guy that went bad. Pharaoh was a bad guy that God was allowing to go worse. And God does this all the time. We see this in the New Testament as well, when God removes people from his church and hands them over to Satan. Sometimes God allows us to continue in our sin to get glory for himself. And this is a hard concept to understand, that God is sovereign, meaning he controls everything. But in ministry, we have to understand this, that God does indeed control everything. And we as creators need to be humble and say, "Lord, we understand that what you're doing. We trust you even in times that we don't fully understand." But back at Israel here, they're now being pushed toward the Red Sea as Egypt, with all the horsemen and all the chariots, were raging at them. And Pharaoh drew near to the people. Pharaoh was coming closer and closer. And Israel lifted up their eyes. They turned and looked toward Egypt. And behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. Who would be afraid if they saw an army charging at them and they had no exit? Yeah. And they turned to the people and they cried out to Moses, "It is because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you done this? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." So Egypt is charging after them, and Israel should have been looking towards God. We know that they are trying to see God's sovereignty here. They're trying to see God. God is moving towards them. But all Israel can see is Egypt. Pay attention to the words here in verse 14. Israel lifted up their eyes, and they saw Egypt, and all they could see was their fear. And it caused them to want to go back into slavery. Go back into slavery. Sometimes people here, out of fear, they return to their sin. Out of bondage and not understanding that their sin is hurtful. Sometimes people return to their sin not because they're afraid, but also because they love their sin more than they love God. And here, Israel should have seen God. That's the whole point of this passage. Israel should have seen God. But instead, all they can do is see their fear. Even though God's trying to tell them over and over again, "I'm going to get glory over Egypt." Look what he says here. Egypt's going to chase you. They already know this. They already knew the plan. They already knew Egypt was going to chase them. They already knew that the Lord was going to get glory. And yet they still were afraid. Moses responds here. And Moses said to the people, this is one of the greatest lines in the story here, "Fear not." In Hebrew, it's Allah ara. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. It's used in the Hebrew Bible 366 times. One for every day of the year, and then plus one for good measure. Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord." Remember, Israel lifted up their eyes. They could only see Egypt. And Moses is saying, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. Moses continues here. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the people to go forward." Moses delivers this awesome speech to Israel. See the salvation. You will never see Egypt again. And then Israel is stuck in its midst, and then they're crying out to the Lord. And the Lord responds very curiously. And he says, "Tell the people to go forward." If you're familiar with the story, you know what's about to happen. You know that God's going to open the sea. But pay attention to the narrative here, because God is telling Israel to go forward before any mention of the sea being opened. God is telling them, why do you cry out? Go forward. We as Christians, we can pray a lot. We love to pray. We love to worship. These are good things to do. Sometimes we can get stuck in these cycles of praying and worshiping, especially in the churches. As ministers, we need to understand this. Sometimes, perhaps, when the Lord makes a path, standing on the other side of it is a sin. When the Lord tells us to go forward, when the Lord tells us to move, when the Lord tells us not to be afraid, this is what we need to do. We need to listen to the Lord here when he says, go forward. And remember, the verse above, it's the Lord who is fighting for them. If it's the Lord's plan, the Lord will make a path. It's the Lord's fight. It's the Lord's victory. And he tells them to go forward. Before I came here, I was a youth pastor in Connecticut. And we were combining some groups and doing some things. And I know that we needed to kind of push the group and move youth group to a different day. It's a big move, and when you do anything in church, you want to make sure there's lots of wisdom and talking to people about it. But even though I had all the facts and all the backing of the leaders and the parents, I was afraid to move the day from Wednesday to Friday. That's all. It was just too much of an interruption, and I knew that I was leaving to come here to seminary. But I knew in my heart that it was the right thing to do. I was afraid to go forward with the big change. And then, I left, came here to seminary, and they moved. They took my advice, and they moved from Wednesday to Friday. And ministry really flourished. And I kind of felt bad that I didn't move forward, that I was afraid to do what the Lord has instructed me to do. And here's the same thing. Sometimes we're afraid to move forward in church ministry. We're afraid to rock the boat, even though the Lord tells us to go forward. So finally, the Lord directs back to Moses, and he says, lift up your staff, stretch out your hands over the sea and divide it. Notice it doesn't say let the sea recess or let the sea go away. He says part, divide the water. Quite a miracle. May Israel go through on dry ground, and I will harden the hearts of Egypt so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory. The Lord's repeating himself here. Israel should have seen God's sovereignty. Israel should have seen the Lord was working in their midst. And even though Israel couldn't see this, they do get the Lord's deliverance. Look as the story progresses. Then the angel of the Lord was going before the host of Israel, and it moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved before them and stood between them. Stood between Israel and Egypt. A giant flaming cloud stood between Egypt and Israel. the Lord was interceding between Egypt and Israel. As the army charged toward them, God put himself in the path. The Lord was fighting for them. This is exactly, of course, what he does for us here as well. That God interceded for us. Jesus Christ interceded for us. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back, a strong east wind all night, and the sea parted on dry ground. The Egyptians pursued and went after them in the midst of the sea, all the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord came down from the pillar of cloud, looked at the Egyptians, and threw the Egyptian forces into panic. So Israel gets away on dry ground. Egypt crosses the sea after them, and it says that God threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels. Some translations, it literally says that the chariot wheels got stuck in mud. So Israel crosses on dry ground. Egypt gets stuck in the mud. And what we see here is that the Lord's making deliverance, and even Egypt sees this. Before Israel, look what he says. The Egyptian said, "Let us flee before Israel, for the Lord fights for them." The Lord fights for them. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back on the Egyptians." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course. And the warning appeared, and the Egyptians fled into it. And the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. Literally it says that God allowed the sea to cover up Egypt. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them, to the right and on the left. There's a summary statement here. And then the story comes to a conclusion. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And Israel saw the great power the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and his servant Moses. Israel finally sees the deliverance of the Lord. They see Egypt on the shore dead. And they see, it says, Israel saw the great power of the Lord used against the Egyptians. It's funny, this is after the plague narratives. You think they would have gotten the picture here. But now it seems that they finally see the power of the Lord. There's an old sign in Walford Student Center before they renovated it. It's a big picture, actually, a painting. And it said, "The journey is the reward." I think of this often. It's not there now, unfortunately. But I think of this often. When I began seminary, I had so many doubts and fears, and some of those came true. But I learned now, after being on this side of the shore, after crossing the sea of seminary, that the Lord does indeed fight for us. And if it's the Lord's plan, he makes a path. And we should not be afraid because the Lord fights for us. Some of you are caught in the midst of a battle between Egypt and the Red Sea. And perhaps the Lord is leading you to the edge of the water. So you understand that he fights for you, that he makes a path, that we do not need to be afraid. Oftentimes we cry out to God in prayer, and we have prayer journals, and these are really good things to do with praying to God. I would suggest maybe that when you write down your prayers, or if you use your phone and record your prayers, there's plenty of prayer apps, that you look back and see when your prayers are answered. We need to look to the Lord and not be afraid. This is the application here today, is the application for Israel. They need to see God. We need to look to the Lord and not be afraid. Look to the Lord and not be afraid. Notice how he answers our prayers. Notice how he fights for us, how he intercedes for us, how he brings salvation to Israel, salvation for us through Jesus Christ on the cross. Some of you are beginning a journey here in seminary. Some of you are in the middle of your journey in seminary. Some of you, like me, are about to leave seminary. You're going through relocation. You're going to have to buy a home. Some of you are facing new jobs for your spouses. Some of you are about to have kids. Some of you are purchasing large bonds, stocks, everything. Know that it's the Lord who fights for you. Know that we should not be afraid. And most importantly, know that we need to look to God when we're afraid. Notice that if it's his plan, it's his path. We should not be afraid. May our eyes be always fixed on the Lord, on his deliverance, on his mercy, on his grace, and on his salvation. May we always see the Lord. Let's close in prayer. Amen. All right, guys, let's pray.